The snow-covered mountains of rural Utah stretched endlessly beyond Jacob Morrison's isolated cabin, where he'd sought refuge from a world that no longer made sense. After losing his wife in a car accident 6 months ago, the former bishop had abandoned his Salt Lake City congregation to live alone with his grief and his wavering faith. But on this bitter February night, a child's sobbing shattered the mountain silence. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, barefoot in the snow, her nightgown soaked with what looked like blood. When Jacob knelt beside her, she looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her face and whispered words in a language that predated Christ himself. The temperature around them plummeted 20 degrees in seconds. His breath turned to ice, and every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary lost child. As Jacob lifted her into his arms, one terrifying question burned in his mind. What if everything he'd been taught about angels and demons was backwards? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The child's weight felt wrong against his chest. Too light, as if her bones were hollow like a bird's. Jacob stumbled through his cabin door, kicking it shut against the wind that had suddenly turned vicious. Inside, the warmth should have been a relief, but the temperature continued dropping. His wood-burning stove, which had been crackling merrily just minutes before, now struggled against an unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the girl herself. "Easy now," Jacob whispered, settling her onto his worn leather couch. The blood on her nightgown was still wet, dark crimson against the white cotton. But as he examined her more closely in the lamplight, he couldn't find any wounds. The blood wasn't hers. The girl's lips moved again, forming those impossible syllables. Jacob had studied ancient languages during his seminary training, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, but this was something else entirely. The words felt heavy in the air, each consonant striking his eardrums like a physical blow. They seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to something primal within him, something that recognized danger. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, wrapping a quilt around her tiny shoulders. She looked up at him with those unsettling eyes, pale blue, almost white, with pupils that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. "Kyle Thara," she said, and this time he understood her perfectly, though she'd spoken in that same ancient tongue. The understanding came not through his ears but through some other channel, as if the meaning had been placed directly into his thoughts. Jacob's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. No signal. The mountains had always been spotty for cell service, but he'd never seen his phone completely dead like this. The display wouldn't even turn on. "Where are your parents?" He tried again, settling into the chair across from her. "How did you get out here?" Kyle Thara tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. When she smiled, her teeth seemed too sharp, too white. "The Watchers brought me to you, Jacob Morrison. They said you would understand. They said your faith is cracking." Ice formed in Jacob's veins. He hadn't told her his name, and she was right about his faith. It had been crumbling since Sarah's death, each unanswered prayer chipping away at his certainty. How could this child possibly know that? "Who are the Watchers?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "The ones who remember the time before the lies, before the books were written to hide the truth." She stood up, the quilt falling away, and Jacob noticed that her feet left no wet marks on his wooden floor despite having been buried in snow. "They chose you because you're beginning to see. Your wife's death opened your eyes, didn't it? Made you question why a loving God would allow such suffering." Jacob shot to his feet, backing away from her. "How do you know about Sarah?" "Know many things. I know you've stopped praying. I know you've been reading books that your church would call forbidden. I know you've been wondering if everything you've taught others might be wrong." Her voice was still that of a child, but the words carried weight beyond her years. The cabin groaned around them, wood contracting in the supernatural cold. Frost began forming on the windows, creeping across the glass in patterns that looked almost like writing. Jacob stared at the symbols, and for a terrifying moment he could almost read them, "What do you want from me?" he whispered. Kael'thara walked to the window, her small hand touching the frost. Where her fingers made contact, the ice turned black. "I want you to help me find my brothers and sisters. 7 of us came down. 7 seeds of truth to plant in the minds of those ready to receive them. But the others, they took the others. Who took them?" She turned back to him, and in her ancient eyes, Jacob saw something that looked like genuine fear. The ones who call themselves righteous. The ones who would rather preserve comfortable lies than face difficult truths. "They're coming for me too, Jacob. And when they do, you'll have to choose which side you're really on." The child's breathing had steadied by dawn, though the fever still burned hot against Ezra's palm. He'd spent the night in the wooden chair beside his bed, watching the rise and fall of small ribs beneath his wife's old quilt. Martha's quilt. The one she'd stitched during the long winter before the cancer took her, her fingers working the needle even when the pain medication made her drowsy. Now it covered a child who spoke in tongues that predated Christ himself. Ezra rubbed his eyes and stepped onto the porch, where the morning air carried the scent of pine and something else, something metallic that made his stomach turn. The blood trail from the previous night had dried to a rust-brown path leading into the forest. Whatever had happened to this child, it had happened close enough for small feet to carry him here. The satellite phone on his kitchen counter seemed to mock him as he poured coffee with shaking hands. One call to Sheriff Morrison, and this would become someone else's problem, the rational thing, the safe thing. But every time he reached for it, he heard Martha's voice from their wedding day, quoting Ruth, "Whither thou goest, I will go." They'd taken that to mean their journey together, but maybe it meant something larger. Maybe it meant following wherever compassion led, even into darkness. Instead, the child whispered in perfect English, "They're coming for me." Ezra's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the wooden floor. "Who's coming? Who hurt you?" But the boy's eyes had already rolled back, fever reclaiming him. Ezra checked the window, scanning the tree line for movement, nothing but morning shadows and the distant call of a hawk. Still, the words burrowed under his skin like splinters. He spent the morning tending the child's wounds with supplies from his medical kit, peroxide, gauze, antibiotic ointment. The cuts were precise, too clean to be accidental. Someone had done this deliberately. The thought made his hands shake as he worked. By noon, the fever had broken enough for the boy to sip water and nibble at bread. Ezra tried again. "What's your name, son?" The child stared at him with those unsettling eyes. "Samuel," he said finally, then something else in that ancient tongue. Hebrew. Ezra was now certain, though not like any Hebrew he'd heard in seminary. "Samuel's a good name, a prophet's name." Ezra settled into his chair. "Can you tell me what happened to you? How you got hurt?" The boy's face went pale. "The men in black coats, they said I was chosen. They said God demanded sacrifice." His voice was too steady for a child, too knowing. "But their God has many teeth." A chill ran down Ezra's spine despite the afternoon warmth. "Where are your parents, Samuel?" "Gone to the light." The boy's matter-of-fact tone made it worse somehow. 3 days passed. "They tried to hide me, but the men found our house, found us all." Ezra's mind raced. 3 days. If the child had been wandering for 3 days with those injuries. "Samuel, where is your house? How far did you walk?" The boy pointed toward the eastern mountains, where the peaks touched clouds, past the dead trees, past the stone with carved eyes, past the place where the earth bleeds. None of that meant anything to Ezra, but the direction made his stomach sink. The eastern range was wilderness, miles of uninhabited forest. If there had been violence out there, if people were dead. The satellite phone rang, shrill in the cabin's silence. Ezra stared at it, his heart hammering. 3 rings, 4. He'd never received a call on that line, had barely used it since Martha died. It was for emergencies only, and the only people who had the number were his bishop and his sister in Salt Lake City. 5 rings, 6. He picked up on the 7th. "Hello?" Static crackled, then a voice that might have been male or female, distorted by interference. "Return what was taken, Brother Mills. Return it or face consequences you cannot imagine." The line went dead. Ezra's hands trembled as he set the phone down. Brother Mills. They knew his name, knew his religion, knew exactly where to find him. He looked at Samuel, who was watching him with those two old eyes. "Are you the thing they want returned?" The child nodded slowly. "I am the key," he said in that ancient Hebrew, then translated himself, "and they will kill anyone who stands between them and God's work." Outside, somewhere in the forest, a branch snapped under heavy footsteps. The child's fever broke near dawn, leaving her skin pale as morning frost. Samuel had dozed fitfully in the wooden chair beside the bed, jerking awake every time she stirred or murmured those incomprehensible words. Now, watching her chest rise and fall in peaceful rhythm, he allowed himself a moment of relief. Martha appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup of coffee, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Any change?" "The fever's gone." Samuel accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm ceramic. "But she hasn't opened her eyes since yesterday." His wife moved closer to the bed, studying the girl's face with maternal concern. In sleep, without the wild terror that had consumed her features, she looked even younger, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that would be beautiful once cleaned and brushed. "I've been thinking," Martha said quietly, "about what you told me, the languages." Samuel had confided everything to his wife after they'd gotten the child settled, the ancient words, the way they'd seemed to echo with authority beyond her years. Martha had listened without judgment, though he'd seen the worry deepen in her eyes. "I called my sister in Salt Lake City this morning," she continued. "Rachel knows people at the university, linguistics professors. Martha, I didn't tell her details, just asked if she knew anyone who specialized in unusual language cases." Samuel set down his coffee, considering. The practical part of him knew they needed help identifying where the child came from, how to reunite her with her family, but something deeper, some instinct honed by years of farming and reading the land's subtle warnings, told him that involving outsiders might be dangerous. What did she say? "There's a professor named Dr. Elena Vasquez. She's worked with law enforcement before, helping with cases involving unusual circumstances." "Hey there, sweetheart," Martha said gently, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. "You're safe now. My name is Martha, and this is my husband Samuel." The girl's gaze moved between them, calculating and cautious. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse but clear. "Where are the others?" The words were in English this time, spoken with a slight accent Samuel couldn't place. Relief flooded through him. At least she could communicate normally. "What others, honey?" Martha asked. The child's face crumpled suddenly, as if the question had unlocked a door she'd been keeping closed. They were screaming. There was so much blood. Her small hands clutched at the quilt. "I tried to run, but the man with the scars caught me. He said I was special. He said I had to learn the old words." Samuel felt his blood chill. "What man? Where did this happen?" "I don't know where. We drove for a long time. Days, maybe. The place smelled like metal and old books." She looked directly at Samuel, her green eyes holding depths no child should possess. "He made me memorize things, poems in languages I didn't understand. He said they were prayers, but they felt wrong, like they were asking for terrible things." Martha reached out to smooth the girl's hair, but the child flinched away instinctively. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily." She paused, then added with heartbreaking uncertainty, "I think. Sometimes he called me other names, names that sounded older." Samuel leaned forward in his chair. "Lily, do you remember your last name, where you lived before?" The girl squeezed her eyes shut, concentrating. "Morrison, Lily Morrison. I lived with my mom in Phoenix." There was a pool at our apartment complex shaped like a kidney bean. Tears began sliding down her cheeks. "Is my mom looking for me?" The raw hope in her voice nearly broke Samuel's heart. He exchanged a meaningful look with Martha. They needed to contact the authorities, search for missing persons reports, but first They needed to understand what they were dealing with. "Lily," he said carefully, "when you were speaking those other languages yesterday, do you remember what you were saying?" She nodded slowly. "The man made me practice them every day. He said if I ever got lost, I should recite them and someone would find me, someone who would take me back to him." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But I don't want to go back. The things he was teaching me, the words, they made other people hurt." Samuel felt ice forming in his stomach. "Other people?" "The man would bring visitors sometimes. He'd make me recite the old words to them, and they'd get strange looks on their faces, like they weren't themselves anymore. Then they'd do things, terrible things." The morning sunlight streaming through the window suddenly felt too bright, too harsh against the darkness of what they were hearing. "The shepherds will come when the moon bleeds," she said, her voice carrying an adult cadence that made Thomas's skin crawl. "They know the lamb has strayed from the fold." Thomas set down the bowl of broth he'd been preparing. "What shepherds, child? Who are you talking about?" He'd been awake all night, watching over her, praying and thinking. The strange symbols on her arms had faded to faint pink marks, like old scars. He tried to convince himself they were just welts from thorns or brambles, but the geometric precision of the patterns suggested something far more deliberate. The sound of an engine approaching made him freeze. Through the window he could see a black SUV winding up the dirt road that led to his property. His nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the postman came on Thursdays. It was Monday. "Hide," he whispered to the girl. But she was already moving, slipping from the bed with surprising agility for someone who'd been near death hours earlier. She pressed herself against the wall beside the bedroom door, and Thomas noticed she'd positioned herself where she could see both the window and the hallway, like someone accustomed to planning escape routes. The vehicle stopped in his yard. 2 figures emerged, a woman in a dark suit and a man wearing the kind of casual clothes that somehow looked more threatening than any uniform. They moved with purpose, scanning the property as they approached his front door. Thomas met them on the porch, pulling the door closed behind him. "Can I help you folks?" "Mr. Whitmore?" The woman's smile was professionally warm and completely hollow. "I'm Agent Chen, Child Protective Services. We received a report about a missing girl in this area." She produced a photograph, and Thomas's heart lurched. It was the child sleeping in his spare room, but cleaned up, wearing a white dress, her hair neatly braided. She looked younger in the picture, and there was something in her eyes, a light that was completely absent now. "Haven't seen her," Thomas said, surprised by how easily the lie came. The man stepped forward. He hadn't introduced himself, and Thomas noticed he wore no badge, carried no official identification. "Mr. Whitmore, this child is very sick. She needs specialized medical care that only we can provide." "What kind of sick?" Agent Chen and her companion exchanged a glance. "It's a rare psychological condition. She experiences episodes where she believes she's possessed. She can become violent, dangerous to herself and others." Thomas thought of the small figure cowering in his bedroom, of the terror in her eyes when she'd first seen him. "She seemed scared when I found her, not violent." "That's part of her condition," the man said. "She cycles between personalities. What you're seeing now is just the calm before the storm." A lie. Thomas was certain of it. Everything about these people felt wrong, the way they stood too close together, how their eyes never stopped moving, the fact that they'd found his remote property with suspicious ease. But he kept his expression neutral, falling back on the poker face that had served him well in his younger, less righteous days. "Well, like I said, I haven't seen any child, but I'll keep an eye out." Agent Chen's smile tightened. "Mr. Whitmore, I should mention that harboring a runaway minor is a felony. The penalties can be quite severe." "I understand. But since I don't have any children here, I suppose that's not a concern." The man took another step forward, and Thomas caught a glimpse of something metallic beneath his jacket. Not a badge, a holster. "You know," the man said conversationally, "we might need to search the premises, just to be thorough. You have a warrant?" The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken threats and calculations. Thomas felt sweat gathering between his shoulder blades despite the cool morning air. Finally, Agent Chen spoke. "That won't be necessary today, but Mr. Whitmore, if you do happen to see this child, please call us immediately, for her own safety." She handed him a business card. The phone number was handwritten, no agency logo, no official seal. They returned to their vehicle and drove away, but Thomas noticed they stopped just past the bend in the road, positioning themselves where they could watch his property while remaining out of sight. He went back inside, his hands shaking slightly as he locked the door. The girl emerged from the bedroom, and when she looked at him, her eyes held a knowledge far too old for her years. "They're not really here to help me, are they?" she whispered. "No," Thomas said quietly. "I don't think they are." The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Samuel stirred oatmeal on the stove, stealing glances at the child who sat wrapped in one of Martha's old quilts. 3 days had passed since he'd found her, and while her physical wounds were healing, the mystery surrounding her only deepened. She ate in silence, her dark eyes following his every movement with an intelligence that unnerved him. When she spoke, which was rarely, it was still in those strange, flowing syllables that made his skin crawl. He'd called Pastor Williams twice, but the man's voicemail was full, and the church secretary said he was visiting family in Salt Lake City. Samuel set a bowl before her and watched as she picked up the spoon with her left hand, then switched to her right, as if testing which felt more natural. Everything about her seemed deliberate, calculated in a way that no child her age should possess. "What's your name?" he asked for the dozenth time, settling into the chair across from her. She tilted her head, studying him with those unsettling eyes. When she spoke, her voice was clear and precise. "Names have power, Samuel Brightwater. You know this." The spoon clattered to the table. She'd never spoken English before, and he'd never told her his full name. "How do you—" He leaned forward, his heart hammering. "How do you know that name?" A smile played at the corners of her mouth, ancient and knowing on such a young face. "Your grandmother called you that, before she died in the wheat field, clutching her chest, calling for you to come home from town. You were 16. Samuel's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. His grandmother's death was something he'd never spoken about to anyone except Martha. The old woman had insisted on working despite her weak heart, and by the time he'd returned from selling grain in Millfield, she was already gone. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You weren't even born then." The child, he was beginning to doubt she was truly a child, continued eating her oatmeal with maddening calm. "Memory isn't bound by flesh, Samuel. Surely your faith has taught you that souls are eternal?" He backed away from the table, his mind reeling. "What are you?" "I am what you made me when you chose mercy over wisdom." She set down her spoon and fixed him with a stare that seemed to pierce straight through him. "When you brought me into your home, instead of leaving me where you found me, you were hurt, bleeding. What kind of man would I be if I'd left a child to die?" The kind who might have saved himself. Her voice carried a weight that pressed against his chest like a physical force. "But it's too late now. The compact is sealed." Samuel's hand found the cross hanging around his neck, his grandmother's gift on his confirmation day. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no compact. I helped an injured child, nothing more." She laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow conveyed infinite sadness. "Oh, Samuel, you really don't understand, do you? 3 days I've been in your home. 3 days you've fed me, sheltered me, cared for my wounds. In the old ways, that creates bonds, obligations. You're talking nonsense. Religious mumbo-jumbo." "Am I?" She stood, the quilt falling away to reveal that her cuts had completely healed, leaving only faint silver scars that seemed to shift and move in the morning light. "Tell me, have you slept well these past 3 nights? Dreamless sleep?" He hadn't. His dreams had been filled with visions he couldn't quite remember upon waking, glimpses of vast chambers carved from black stone, chanting voices in languages that predated human speech, and always, always, the sense that something was watching him from just beyond his perception. "I see the truth in your eyes," she continued, moving closer with steps that made no sound on the wooden floor. "You felt them. haven't you? The others. They know where I am now, thanks to you. The others? Those who seek what I carry. What I've always carried. She reached up and touched her throat, where a thin silver chain was barely visible beneath her skin. They've been hunting me for longer than your people have walked upright, but I've learned to hide, to take forms they wouldn't suspect. Look at me, Samuel. Really look. Against his better judgment, he met her gaze directly. For a moment, her features seemed to shimmer, revealing something else beneath, older, more terrible, with eyes like starlight and sorrow. The vision lasted only a heartbeat before she was a child again, but it was enough. "What do you want?" he whispered. "What I've always wanted. To survive. To keep what I guard safe from those who would use it to unmake the world." She moved to the window and peered out at the empty fields. "But they're coming now. Tonight, perhaps tomorrow. And when they arrive, Samuel Brightwater, you'll have to choose which side of eternity you want to stand on." The stranger's eyes held no warmth as he studied Ezra through the screen door. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a crisp suit that seemed absurdly formal for rural Utah. His smile never reached those cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Whitmore? I'm Agent David Chen with Child Protective Services." He flashed a badge too quickly for Ezra to examine closely. "We received reports about an unaccompanied minor on your property." Ezra's grip tightened on the doorframe. Behind him, he could hear Samuel's soft breathing from the couch where the boy had finally fallen asleep after another episode of speaking those impossible languages. The Latin phrases still echoed in Ezra's mind, words about darkness and salvation that no 6-year-old should know. "I called the sheriff yesterday," Ezra said carefully. "Sheriff Morrison said he'd handle it." "Sheriff Morrison contacted our office. Standard procedure in cases involving abandoned children." Chen's tone remained perfectly pleasant, but something predatory lurked beneath the professional veneer. "I'm here to ensure the child receives proper care and placement." Through the screen, Ezra noticed Chen's shoes, expensive leather, completely clean despite the dusty road leading to the cabin. No government worker drove out here without getting dirty. The man's hands were soft, manicured. Not the hands of someone who dealt with distressed families in rural communities. "It's late," Ezra said. "Boy's sleeping. Maybe you could come back in the morning?" "I'm afraid this can't wait. We have reason to believe the child may be in immediate danger." Chen's hand moved to his jacket. "May I come in?" Ezra hesitated. Every instinct screamed danger, but refusing entry to a supposed government official would only create more problems. "Let me see that badge again." Chen held up the leather wallet but kept it at a distance. The badge looked official enough, but something felt wrong. The ID photo seemed too crisp, too new. "Where's your vehicle?" Ezra asked. "Parked down the road. Didn't want to wake anyone unnecessarily." Chen's smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to see the child. Now." "You know," Ezra said slowly, "it's funny. Sheriff Morrison never mentioned calling CPS, said he'd look into missing person reports himself." Chen's hand moved inside his jacket. "Mr. Whitmore, you're interfering with an official investigation, and you're not who you claim to be." The pretense dropped instantly. Chen's hand emerged holding a pistol, but Ezra was already moving. He slammed the main door shut and threw the deadbolt as the first shot splintered the doorframe. "Samuel!" Ezra shouted, rushing to the couch. The boy was awake, eyes wide with terror but somehow unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "We need to go, now." More shots punched through the door. Chen was using a suppressor. The sounds were muffled pops rather than the sharp cracks Ezra expected. Professional equipment. This wasn't some random predator or even a standard kidnapping. Ezra scooped Samuel up and headed for the back door, his mind racing. The truck was parked out front, blocked by whoever Chen really was. The storm cellar was too obvious. That left the forest, but traveling at night with a child through rough terrain would be suicide. "The barn," Samuel whispered in his ear. "There's something in the barn they want." "What are you talking about?" But there was no time for explanations. The front door gave way with a crash of splintering wood. Ezra burst through the rear exit and sprinted across the yard, Samuel clinging to his shoulders. Behind them, flashlight beams swept through the cabin windows. The barn loomed ahead, ancient wood silvered by moonlight. Ezra had built it himself 15 years ago, solid post and beam construction that had weathered countless storms. He yanked open the side door and plunged into the musty darkness. The floor, Samuel whispered urgently. Under the hay. Ezra set the boy down and grabbed a pitchfork, frantically clearing loose hay from the center of the barn. His hands found what Samuel had somehow known was there, a section of floorboards that didn't match the rest. Newer wood, carefully fitted but not nailed down. He pried up the boards and stared into a hidden compartment he'd never known existed. Inside lay a metal case, military-grade and locked. Attached to it was an envelope marked with symbols that made his eyes water to look at directly. "How did you know?" he demanded. Samuel's response came in that ancient language again, words that seemed to bypass Ezra's ears and burrow directly into his brain. But this time, impossibly, he understood. "Because they've been hunting me my whole life. And this is why." Footsteps crunched on gravel outside. Chen had found them. The silence in the living room stretched like a taut wire as Thomas stared at the phone in his hand. Dr. Martinez's words echoed in his mind. Multiple healed fractures, severe malnutrition, signs of prolonged confinement. The clinical terms couldn't mask the horror they described. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. What did the doctor say? Thomas set the phone down carefully as if it might shatter. The boy's been hurt, badly, for a long time. He couldn't bring himself to repeat the details about the bone damage, the evidence of systematic abuse that painted a picture too dark for words. "Oh, that poor child," Sarah's voice cracked. "How could anyone—" "I don't know." Thomas ran his fingers through his hair. "But whoever did this, they're still out there, and they're looking for him." "We need to call someone," Sarah said, settling beside him on the couch. "The police, maybe the FBI. This is bigger than us, Thomas." "With what proof?" Thomas gestured toward the stairs where the boy slept. "A child who speaks languages that haven't been used in centuries. Men in black suits who made veiled threats and disappeared. They'll think we've lost our minds." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers worrying the edge of the dish towel. "What about Bishop Crawford? He might know what to do." Thomas considered this. James Crawford had been their bishop for 8 years, a steady man who'd guided the ward through countless crises. But this felt beyond the scope of pastoral care, beyond the comfortable boundaries of faith and community service. "Maybe," Thomas said, though doubt gnawed at him. "How did you explain to anyone that divine intervention might look like a bloodied child speaking Aramaic?" Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Both Thomas and Sarah froze, listening. The sound came again. Deliberate footsteps, too heavy to be the boy. Thomas's blood turned to ice. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the kitchen as quietly as possible. The back door was closer, offered better escape routes across the fields he knew by heart. Another creak, this time on the stairs. Thomas pressed Sarah against the kitchen wall and peered around the corner. The staircase was visible from this angle, and what he saw made his breath catch. A shadow moved along the upstairs hallway, large, human-shaped, definitely not the boy. "Stay here," he whispered to Sarah, then grabbed the shotgun from the mudroom closet. The familiar weight of it steadied his nerves slightly. He crept toward the base of the stairs, the weapon ready. "Who's up there?" His voice carried more authority than he felt. The footsteps stopped. "I know someone's there. I'm armed, and I've already called the sheriff." The lie came easily. Silence stretched for 30 seconds, then a voice drifted down, calm, professional, and chillingly familiar. "Mr. Whitmore, there's no need for weapons. We're here to help." It was the same voice from this morning, the leader of the 2 men in suits. Thomas's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Get out of my house, now." "I'm afraid that's not possible. Not until we retrieve what belongs to us." The boy doesn't belong to anyone. Thomas started up the stairs, each step deliberate, especially not to people who torture children. A soft laugh echoed from above. Torture? Is that what you think this is about? Mr. Whitmore, you have no idea what you're dealing with. That child is not what he appears to be. Thomas reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched before him, doors to the bedrooms standing open. He could see into the guest room where they'd left the boy. The bed was empty, sheets thrown back. Where is he? Safe, for now. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But his safety depends entirely on your cooperation. What do you want? Simple. Forget this happened. Forget you ever saw the child. Go back to your quiet life, tend your crops, say your prayers. Pretend this was all a dream. Thomas swung the shotgun toward the master bedroom, where the voice seemed strongest. And if I refuse? Then you'll discover that there are worse things than losing your faith, Mr. Whitmore. You'll lose everything else as well. A window slammed somewhere in the house, then another. The sound of glass breaking came from downstairs, Sarah's scream following immediately after. Thomas ran toward the stairs, but stopped when he saw the boy standing at the far end of the hallway. The child's eyes were wide with terror, his mouth moving soundlessly. No, not soundlessly. The words were there, barely audible, in that same ancient tongue. But this time, somehow, Thomas understood them perfectly. And coming back. They're all coming back. The girl, who still hadn't told him her name, spoke languages that shouldn't exist anymore. Yesterday, she'd muttered what sounded like ancient Aramaic while picking at a breakfast. This morning, she'd recited something in what Marcus was certain was biblical Hebrew, her young voice carrying inflections that suggested centuries of linguistic evolution he couldn't begin to comprehend. His laptop glowed in the dim light, browser tabs multiplying like weeds as he searched for answers. Archaeological forums, theological databases, missing children reports. Everything led to dead ends or questions that made his faith feel suddenly fragile. The blood on her dress when he'd found her had vanished after washing, but the memory of its metallic scent lingered in his nostrils. A soft knock at the door made him freeze. The sound came again, measured and deliberate. Marcus glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. Nobody visited at this hour, not in these mountains, not unless something was terribly wrong. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A black sedan sat in his driveway, its engine ticking as it cooled. Two figures stood on his porch, a man and woman in dark clothing, their faces obscured by shadow. "Mr. Whitmore?" The woman's voice carried authority despite its measured tone. "We'd like to speak with you about the girl." Marcus's blood turned to ice water. He hadn't told anyone about finding her. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and he'd made no calls, filed no reports. How could they possibly know? "We know you're there, Mr. Whitmore. We're here to help." Behind him, the child stirred on the couch, her eyes opening to reveal that strange, knowing awareness that seemed too old for her small face. She looked directly at him and slowly shook her head. "There's been a misunderstanding," the man called out now, his voice smoother, almost hypnotic. "The girl is sick, Mr. Whitmore. She needs medical attention that you can't provide. We're here to take her somewhere safe." Marcus backed away from the window, his mind racing. The child had sat up now, watching him with those impossibly deep eyes. When she spoke, it was in perfect English, her first clear word since he'd found her. "They are not what they seem." The simple statement hit him like a physical blow. Her voice carried no trace of the confusion or fear he'd expect from a lost child. Instead, there was something ancient in her tone, a weight that made his skin crawl. The knocking came again, more insistent now. "Mr. Whitmore, we know you're a good man, a faithful man, but you're in over your head here. Open the door and we can explain everything." Marcus grabbed his shotgun from the closet, checking the shells with trembling fingers. He'd used it for hunting, for scaring off the occasional bear, but never imagined he might need it against people. The weight felt foreign and terrible in his hands. "Who are they?" he whispered to the girl. She tilted her head, considering the question with disturbing gravity. They serve the one who seeks to reclaim what was taken. What was taken? Before she could answer, the lights went out. The hum of his refrigerator died, and even the distant sound of the wind seemed to fade. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. A new voice spoke from outside, deeper, with an accent he couldn't place. The words weren't in English, but somehow Marcus understood their meaning. Ancient words about blood and covenant, about debts that must be paid, and children who belonged to powers older than his comprehension. The girl stood up from the couch, moving with fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone her age. In the darkness, her eyes reflected light that wasn't there, like an animal's. "They cannot enter without invitation," she said. "But they will not leave." "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he was still talking to a child. "To choose," she replied simply, "as all mortals must when the veil grows thin." Outside, footsteps circled the cabin, slow, deliberate, predatory. Marcus counted at least 4 sets now, though only 2 people had knocked. The mathematical impossibility of it made his head spin. His phone lay dead on the table, though it had been fully charged. The landline produced no dial tone. Whatever these people were, wherever they'd come from, they'd cut him off from the world as effectively as if his cabin had been transported to another dimension. Marcus pressed his back against the wall, shotgun clutched in white-knuckled hands, and realized that his simple life of faith and farming had just collided with something that would either damn his soul or transform it forever. The child's fever broke sometime before dawn, but Samuel barely noticed. He sat hunched over his kitchen table, surrounded by printouts from the library and pages of handwritten notes that made less sense with each passing hour. The ancient symbols the boy had carved into the dirt matched hieroglyphs from 3 different civilizations, Egyptian, Sumerian, and something else entirely that predated both. Sarah moved quietly through the cabin, checking on the boy who now slept peacefully in Samuel's bed. She'd arrived the night before with medical supplies and questions that Samuel couldn't answer. Now she stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. A 6-year-old couldn't know these languages. "They're dead languages, Samuel. Some of these symbols, they're not even fully translated by scholars." Samuel rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of sleepless nights. "I know what I heard, Sarah." He spoke them fluently, like they were his native tongue. The sound of a vehicle approaching made them both freeze. Samuel peered through the curtains to see Sheriff Martinez's patrol car pulling into his driveway, followed by a black sedan with government plates. His stomach dropped. "Take the boy," Samuel said urgently. "There's a root cellar behind the barn. The entrance is hidden under the hay bales." Sarah didn't question him. She moved swiftly to gather the child, who stirred but remained mostly unconscious. Samuel watched them slip out the back door before walking to meet his visitors. Sheriff Martinez stepped out first, his face grim. Behind him emerged a woman in a crisp black suit, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses, despite the early morning gloom. "Morning, Samuel," Martinez said, though his usual warmth was absent. "This is Agent Diana Reeves with the FBI. We need to talk." Samuel nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Of course. Come in." They settled in his living room, and Samuel noticed how Agent Reeves' eyes swept the space, cataloguing every detail. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 35, with prematurely grey hair pulled back severely. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about that," Samuel replied carefully. Reeves smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's interesting, because we have witness reports of you at the public library yesterday researching ancient languages and symbols, very specific searches related to our investigation." Samuel's pulse quickened, but he maintained eye contact. "I study ancient texts as part of my faith. The Book of Mormon contains many historical references to Sumerian death rituals." Reeves pulled out a tablet showing him screenshots of his search history, to blood sacrifice ceremonies, to something called the language of the first dark. The last phrase hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd found only one reference to it, buried in an obscure academic paper about pre-flood civilizations. The paper had been removed from the database while he was reading it, the screen going blank, as if the information had never existed. Sheriff Martinez leaned forward. "Samuel, if you know something about this boy, you need to tell us. There are dangerous people looking for him, people who've already killed to find him." "What people?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he didn't want the answer. Agent Reeves exchanged a glance with Martinez. "Have you ever heard of the Crimson Dawn Foundation?" Samuel shook his head, but the name sent ice through his veins. "They're a religious organization," Reeves continued. "Very wealthy, very secretive. They believe in something called the Great Awakening, the return of pre-flood knowledge and power. They think this boy is the key to accessing that power." "That's insane," Samuel said. "Is it?" Reeves stood and walked to his window, looking out toward the barn. 3 days ago, this boy vanished from a maximum security medical facility where he was being studied. The night he disappeared, everyone in the building had the same dream. Visions of a great flood, of beings descending from the sky, of a language that could reshape reality itself. Samuel felt sweat beading on his forehead. "You're talking about fairy tales." "The facility's head researcher was found dead this morning," Martinez said quietly. "Carved open like a sacrifice, and written on the wall in his blood were symbols identical to the ones you were researching." Agent Reeves turned back to Samuel. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe you're a good man trying to do the right thing, but this boy isn't what you think he is. The people hunting him aren't just dangerous. They're true believers willing to tear apart reality itself to get what they want." Agent Reeves smiled again, and this time it was genuinely predatory. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Whitmore. Now, let's go collect our missing child." The child's screams pierced the pre-dawn darkness, jolting Samuel from restless sleep. He found her convulsing on the kitchen floor, her small body rigid as inhuman sounds poured from her lips. Not the ancient languages this time, but something worse. Guttural, animalistic noises that made his skin crawl. "Easy, little one," he whispered, kneeling beside her. The moment his hands touched her shoulders, the convulsions stopped. Her eyes snapped open, pupils dilated and wild. Samuel's blood ran cold. Through the kitchen window he spotted headlights cutting through the morning mist, still distant but approaching fast. Multiple vehicles. "How did you—" he began, but stopped himself. Questions could wait. He scooped the child into his arms and rushed to the bedroom, grabbing the go-bag he'd prepared after yesterday's encounter with Dr. Whitmore. Some instinct had told him this moment would come. The vehicles were closer now, their engines growing louder. Samuel peered through the bedroom curtains and counted at least 4 SUVs moving with military precision down his gravel drive. These weren't local authorities or even federal agents. The vehicles were unmarked, expensive, and filled with people who clearly didn't want to be identified. "The root cellar," he muttered, remembering the hidden space his grandfather had built during the Depression. Samuel had used it for storage, but it connected to an old mining tunnel that emerged near the creek, 1/2 mile from the house. He carried the child through the kitchen, pausing only to grab bottles of water and the pistol he kept in the drawer, a weapon he'd never imagined using against another human being. The cellar door was concealed beneath a worn rug in the pantry. Samuel pulled it open, revealing wooden steps descending into darkness. "I don't want to go underground," the child whispered, clinging to his neck. "That's where they kept me before, in the dark place. This is different," Samuel assured her, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. "This leads to freedom." Car doors slammed outside. Samuel heard voices, professional and clipped, giving orders. Someone was directing others around the property's perimeter. They'd planned this carefully. He descended into the cellar just as boots thundered across his front porch. The musty space smelled of earth and old preserves, but the tunnel entrance was exactly where he remembered, hidden behind stacked wooden crates that he quickly moved aside. The tunnel beyond was narrow, carved roughly through rock and dirt. Samuel had explored it as a boy, but that was 40 years ago. He prayed it hadn't collapsed. Above them, his front door splintered open. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, accompanied by shouted commands and the crash of overturned furniture. Someone was methodically searching every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Samuel crawled through the tunnel with the child pressed against his chest, their progress maddeningly slow. The passage was tighter than he remembered, forcing him to army crawl through sections that scraped his shoulders raw. The child remained unnaturally quiet, as if she understood that their lives depended on silence. "Samuel Brennan," a voice called from somewhere above them, the sound filtering down through layers of earth and wood. "We know you're here. We're not going to hurt anyone. We just want to help the child." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Samuel almost believed it himself. But he'd seen the terror in the child's eyes, heard her speak of places with no windows. Whatever these people wanted, it wasn't to help. The tunnels seemed to stretch forever. Samuel's lungs burned from the stale air, and his knees were bloody from crawling across rough stone. Behind them, the sounds of searching had grown more frantic. They were running out of time. Finally, blessed cool air touched his face. The tunnel's exit was overgrown with brambles, invisible from the outside but navigable if you knew where to push through. Samuel emerged into the grey dawn, gasping and pulling the child after him. The creek babbled nearby, swollen with autumn rains. On the far side, dense forest stretched for miles, wilderness that Samuel knew better than any outsider ever could. If they could reach those trees, they might have a chance. He waded into the icy water, the child on his back. Halfway across, she spoke again, her words barely audible over the flowing water. "The man with the scar," she whispered. "He's here. He found us." Samuel's breath caught. Through the trees, maybe 200 yards away, a figure in a dark coat stood watching them. Even at this distance, Samuel could see the pale line that ran from the man's left temple to his jaw, the same scar Dr. Whitmore had described. The figure raised something to his lips. A radio. Samuel plunged forward, fighting the current, as the net began to close around them once more. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead as Samuel led Emma deeper into the canyon. Behind them, the distant rumble of engines grew closer. Whoever was hunting them had found the trail. His boots scraped against loose shale, each step echoing off the narrow walls like whispered warnings. "How much further?" Emma's voice was barely audible, but Samuel caught the tremor in it. The girl who had spoken ancient languages with otherworldly authority now sounded like what she truly was, a frightened child. "Not far," he whispered back, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Brother Kellerman's directions had been hasty, sketched on the back of a receipt in the Diner-S parking lot before the older man had driven off to create what he'd called a distraction. The safe house was supposed to be hidden in these canyons, but every shadow looked the same in the darkness. A helicopter's distant thrum made them both freeze. Samuel switched off the flashlight, plunging them into absolute blackness. Emma's small hand found his, her fingers ice-cold despite the warm night. "They're really trying to find me," she said, and there was something different in her voice now. Not just fear, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd always known this moment would come. "Emma," Samuel said carefully, "what did they do to you before you came to my cabin?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the helicopter growing louder. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it, they said I was special, that God had chosen me for something important. She paused. "But it didn't feel like God, Mr. Whitmore. It felt like the opposite." Samuel's blood ran cold. In his mind, fragments began connecting. The pharmaceutical company, the strange symbols carved into Emma's skin, the way she'd spoken languages that shouldn't exist. What kind of tests did they do? Injections, lots of them, and they would put me in a room with things, animals mostly, dead ones. Her grip on his hand tightened. They wanted me to bring them back, and when I couldn't, they'd get angry and give me more medicine. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its searchlight sweeping the canyon floor. Samuel pressed Emma against the rock wall, both of them holding their breath as the beam passed mere feet from their hiding spot. "That's why the words come out wrong sometimes," Emma continued once the helicopter had moved on. The medicine made everything mixed up inside my head. Sometimes I remember things that haven't happened yet. Sometimes I speak words I've never learned. Samuel felt his worldview shifting again, pieces of a horrific puzzle falling into place. Not possession or divine intervention, but something far more sinister. Human experimentation on a child. How long were you there? I don't remember coming to that place. But the calendar in the doctor's office, it said it was 2023. I remember my birthday party before the hospital, and that was 2021. 2 years. 2 years of a child's life stolen for God knew what purpose. Samuel's anger burned hot in his chest, but beneath it lay a deeper fear. If they'd found Emma once, they could find her again. And if the pharmaceutical company had resources like helicopters and armed men, what chance did a simple farmer have against them? The sound of voices echoed from the canyon entrance behind them. Flashlight beams danced across the walls, still distant but getting closer. Samuel fumbled for his own light, keeping it pointed down at Kellerman's crude map. "This way," he whispered, guiding Emma toward what looked like a branching path. The canyon split here, one passage continuing straight, while another, narrower opening led off to the right. According to the map, the safe house was through the smaller passage. They squeezed through the gap, Emma's breathing sharp with exhaustion. The passage opened into a small clearing surrounded by high walls, and there, barely visible in the starlight, stood a weathered cabin tucked against the canyon wall. Samuel approached cautiously, Emma close behind him. The windows were dark, no sign of life, but when he tried the door, it opened easily. Inside, the beam of his flashlight revealed a simple space, a few cots, shelves stocked with canned goods, and a battery-powered radio sitting on a rough wooden table. "Are we safe here?" Emma asked, settling onto one of the cots with visible relief. Samuel wanted to say yes, to offer her the comfort she desperately needed. But as he moved to the window and peered out at the canyon walls above them, he saw the helicopter's light still searching, methodical and patient. "For now," he said, which was the most honest answer he could give. Emma curled up on the cot, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. As Samuel watched her drift toward sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only delayed the inevitable. Somewhere out there, powerful people wanted this child back, and they weren't going to stop looking. He picked up the radio, wondering if Brother Kellerman was still alive to answer. The basement beneath Dr. Voss's clinic stretched far deeper than Thomas had imagined possible. The stone walls wept with moisture, and the air grew thicker with each descending step. Emergency lighting cast sickly yellow pools that left more shadows than illumination, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rhythmic hum of machinery. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers ice-cold despite the underground warmth. Behind them, Marcus moved with surprising stealth for such a large man, his breathing controlled and purposeful. They had left Rebecca hidden in the tree line, with strict instructions to call Sheriff Morrison if they weren't back within 2 hours. Thomas prayed it wouldn't come to that. The corridor branched into multiple passages, each marked with symbols that made Thomas's skin crawl. They weren't quite the same as what he'd seen in the cabin or carved into young Anna's flesh, but they shared a disturbing similarity, angular, aggressive marks that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision. "This way," Sarah whispered, consulting something on her phone. The building plans show a large chamber directly beneath the main surgical suite. They followed the central passage, past doors that Thomas didn't want to think about. Some were marked with clinical labels, storage, archives, specimens, while others bore only numbers. From behind one, they heard a sound that might have been sobbing, though it could just as easily have been the building's ventilation system. The passage opened into a circular chamber that took Thomas's breath away. The room was vast, carved from natural rock and fitted with modern equipment that hummed with quiet efficiency. Banks of monitors lined the walls, displaying what appeared to be medical readouts, heart rates, brain activity, blood pressure. At least a dozen beds were arranged in concentric circles around a central platform, and on each bed lay a child. Thomas's legs nearly gave out. The children ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 16, all unconscious, all connected to IV lines and monitoring equipment. Their heads had been partially shaved, revealing surgical scars and what looked like small metal implants. Anna wasn't among them, but that fact brought no relief. "My God," Marcus breathed. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah was already moving between the beds, checking charts and equipment with professional efficiency. "These readings," she said, her voice tight with horror. "They're monitoring neurological activity, but the patterns are wrong. It's like their brains are being artificially stimulated." Thomas forced himself to look closer at the nearest child, a boy who couldn't have been older than 10. The surgical scars formed a pattern around his temples, following the same angular design they'd seen elsewhere. The child's eyes moved rapidly beneath closed lids, and his lips moved silently, as if speaking words only he could hear. "They're creating them," Thomas realized, the full scope of the horror washing over him. "The children speaking ancient languages. This is how they're made." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the passage they'd come through. Sarah grabbed Thomas's arm, pulling him toward a bank of equipment that offered some concealment. Marcus pressed himself against the wall near the entrance, his hands clenched into fists. Dr. Voss entered the chamber flanked by 2 men Thomas didn't recognize. The doctor moved with casual familiarity, checking monitors and adjusting settings on various machines as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "The neural pathways are stabilizing beautifully," Voss said to his companions. "Subject 7 has been accessing linguistic patterns dating back over 3 millennia. The applications are extraordinary." One of the men, tall and gaunt with prematurely white hair, nodded approvingly. "And the girl? The one that escaped?" "A temporary setback. She was our most promising subject, naturally occurring rather than artificially induced. Her neural patterns showed unprecedented clarity." Voss paused at one of the beds, studying a readout with scientific fascination. "But we'll recover her. The implant ensures she can't go far without us knowing." Thomas's blood turned to ice. Anna had an implant. They'd been tracking her this entire time. "The farmer poses a problem," the white-haired man continued. "His involvement has drawn unwanted attention." "Easily resolved," Voss replied with chilling indifference. "Rural accidents are tragically common. A house fire, perhaps, or farm equipment malfunction." Sarah's grip on Thomas's arm tightened to the point of pain. He could see the terror in her eyes, but also something else, determination. She pointed silently toward a service exit on the far side of the chamber, then held up her phone, indicating she was recording everything. The 3 men moved deeper into the chamber, their voices growing quieter but no less sinister. Thomas knew they had to leave, had to get this evidence to someone who could stop this nightmare. But as they began to creep toward the exit, one of the children, a girl with dark hair and surgical scars covering half her scalp, opened her eyes and looked directly at him. Her mouth opened, and words poured forth in a language that predated Christ, predated civilization itself. Words that spoke of darkness and hunger and things that should never walk among the living. The men turned toward them, and Thomas knew their time had just run out. The basement felt like a tomb as Samuel descended the wooden stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The air grew thicker with every breath, heavy with a metallic scent of blood and something else, something that reminded him of sulfur and decay. His flashlight beam danced across stone walls that seemed to pulse in the wavering light. Behind him, Rebecca's footsteps faltered. "Samuel, maybe we should—" "No." His voice came out harder than intended. "We've come too far to turn back now." The tunnel opened into a circular chamber, carved from living rock. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Dozens of candles flickered around the perimeter, their flames casting dancing shadows that made the carved symbols appear to move. In the center of the room stood an altar, black stone polished to a mirror finish, stained dark with what could only be blood. "Dear God," Rebecca whispered behind him. But it wasn't the altar that made Samuel's blood turn to ice. It was the photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned to wooden boards arranged around the chamber's walls. Children's faces stared back at him from school pictures, family photos, missing person flyers. Some images were recent, printed on glossy paper. Others were yellowed with age, dating back decades. Samuel stepped closer to one board, his flashlight illuminating a collection that made his stomach churn. The boy he'd found, the child who'd appeared outside his cabin speaking in tongues, stared back at him from at least a dozen photographs. But the pictures showed him at different ages, spanning what looked like years. "That's impossible," Samuel murmured, studying the images. In one, the boy appeared perhaps 6 years old. In another, he looked 10. The most recent showed him exactly as Samuel remembered, pale, thin, with those unsettling dark eyes. Rebecca moved to another board, her sharp intake of breath echoing through the chamber. "Samuel, look at this!" The second collection showed different children, but the pattern was the same. Each child photographed over years, aging slowly through the images until the final pictures showed them as Samuel had seen the boy. Hollow-eyed, speaking in languages that predated Christ. "How long has this been going on?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Samuel's flashlight found a third board, then a fourth. Dozens of children, all following the same progression, all ending the same way. His hands shook as he counted the collections, 23 boards in total, representing decades of systematic abuse. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the chamber, the scrape of stone against stone. Samuel spun toward the noise, his beam illuminating a narrow passage he hadn't noticed before. The sound came again, followed by something that made his blood freeze. Singing. Children's voices, high and pure, echoing from the depths of the tunnel. But the melody was wrong, the words in that same ancient tongue the boy had spoken. The harmony was perfect, inhuman in its precision. "We need to leave," Rebecca said, backing toward the stairs. "Right now?" His foot struck something metallic, sending it skittering across the stone floor. Samuel's light followed the sound, illuminating a brass key ornate with engravings that matched the wall symbols. Without thinking, he pocketed it. The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the unholy chorus. Samuel strained his ears, listening for any sound from the deeper tunnel. Nothing. Even the candle flames seemed to still. Then footsteps echoed from the passage, not the light patter of children's feet, but the heavy tread of adult boots. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. "Samuel!" Rebecca hissed from the stairs. "They're coming!" He turned and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted across the chamber. Behind him, voices called out in alarm. Men shouting orders in English now, the ancient languages abandoned for more practical communication. Samuel reached the stairs just as lights began to spill from the deeper passage. He and Rebecca climbed frantically, their footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. Behind them, the pursuit began in earnest. They emerged into the cabin's main room, gasping for air. Samuel slammed the basement door and threw the bolt, knowing it would only buy them minutes at most. "The truck!" he panted, grabbing Rebecca's arm. "We have to reach the truck." Through the cabin's windows, Samuel could see more lights approaching through the trees. They were surrounded. "How much further?" Marcus whispered, though the acoustics down here made even whispers carry like shouts. Sarah stopped abruptly, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. When she spoke, it was in that otherworldly voice that still sent ice through Thomas's veins. "The chamber of binding lies beyond the seventh seal, where the faithful once sought communion with forces older than their God." Thomas felt his faith fracture a little more with each word. This wasn't the innocent child he'd found bleeding outside his cabin. This was something else entirely, something that spoke with knowledge spanning centuries. Yet when he looked down at her face in the flashlight's glow, he saw only a frightened little girl whose eyes held depths no child should possess. The corridor opened into a circular chamber carved from living rock. 7 alcoves ringed the space, each containing stone pedestals topped with objects Thomas couldn't immediately identify. The air here felt different, charged, like the moments before lightning strikes. His skin prickled with electricity that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "Dear God," Marcus breathed, stepping into the chamber. "This place, it's older than the church above, much older." Sarah released Thomas's hand and walked to the center of the room, where a complex pattern had been etched into the floor. The design hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves in impossible ways. As she reached the center, the carved lines began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow. "They built their house of worship over our sacred space," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in Thomas's bones. "They thought their prayers and hymns could sanctify what we had already claimed. They were wrong." Sarah turned to face him, and for a moment her features seemed to shift, becoming angular and alien before settling back into the face of a 7-year-old girl. "We are the ones who were here first. Before your Christ, before your prophets, before your God claimed dominion over the hearts of men. We offered a different path, a deeper truth. But we were cast out, branded as demons and devils by those who feared what they could not understand." The temperature in the chamber plummeted. Thomas could see his breath misting as Marcus pressed against the wall, his face pale with terror. The objects on the pedestals began to vibrate, producing a low harmonic that seemed to burrow into Thomas's skull. "The children we take," Sarah continued, "they are not victims, they are gifts, vessels through which we can return to a world that has forgotten us. But the process is difficult. Most minds break under the weight of what we are. This one," she gestured to herself, "has proven remarkably resilient." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and pure. "Let her go. Whatever you are, whatever you want, take me instead." Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your faith makes you strong, Thomas Whitmore, but it also makes you blind. This child called to us. Her suffering, her pain, her desperate need to escape a world that had shown her only cruelty. It created a resonance we could not ignore. We offered her freedom from that pain. By possessing her, by stealing her life, by giving her power." Sarah's eyes flared with inner light. She will never again know hunger, abuse, or abandonment. She will walk between worlds, wielding forces your kind has forgotten. "Is that not mercy?" Marcus suddenly pushed away from the wall, his face twisted with desperate determination. "There has to be a way to undo this, some kind of reversal." "The binding can be broken," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But the price is higher than either of you would be willing to pay." Thomas stepped closer to the center of the circle, feeling the power emanating from the carved symbols like heat from a forge. "Tell me." "A life freely given in place of one taken. But not just any life, one filled with true faith, unmarked by doubt or sin, a soul pure enough to bridge the gap between what is and what should be." Her gaze locked with his. "How deep does your faith run, Thomas Whitmore? Deep enough to die for a stranger's child?" The chamber fell silent except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness beyond. Thomas stared into those ancient eyes wearing a child's face, weighing the magnitude of what was being offered. Behind him, Marcus whispered prayers that seemed to be swallowed by the hungry darkness pressing in from all sides. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed like angry wasps as Marcus paced the worn linoleum. Sarah sat hunched in a plastic chair, her face pale beneath the harsh lighting. The child, Rebecca, as she'd finally told them her name was, lay sedated 3 rooms down, doctors running tests that Marcus prayed would provide answers instead of more questions. "The blood work came back," Dr. Chen said, approaching with a clipboard clutched against her chest. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus had learned to read the subtle tells of medical professionals over the years. Something was wrong. "What did you find?" Sarah asked, rising from her chair. "That's just it. We didn't find anything. No trace of drugs, no evidence of trauma beyond the obvious injuries from her time in the wilderness. Her brain scans are normal, blood pressure, heart rate, neurological responses. Everything is perfectly healthy for a 7-year-old girl." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "Then how do you explain what we witnessed? The languages, the knowledge she couldn't possibly have?" Dr. Chen's gaze flickered between them. "I can't. Medically speaking, there's no explanation for what you've described. But I have to ask, are you certain about what you heard? Stress and fear can sometimes— We know what we heard, Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. And we have it recorded. The doctor's eyebrows rose. Recorded? Marcus pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he navigated to the audio file he'd captured during one of Rebecca's episodes. The ancient syllables filled the corridor, guttural and haunting. Dr. Chen's face went white. "I'll need to speak with the psychiatric team," she said quietly. "This is beyond my expertise." As she hurried away, Marcus noticed a familiar figure emerging from the elevator. Detective Morrison's weathered face was grim, his coat damp from the rain that had started falling an hour ago. "Found something you need to see," Morrison said without preamble. He handed Marcus a manila folder. "The Caldwell property." We dug deeper into its history. Marcus opened the folder, Sarah leaning over his shoulder to read. The documents were old, some photocopied from century-old records, property deeds, newspaper clippings, and what looked like police reports from the 1920s. "Seems your neighbors weren't the first to use that land for unusual purposes," Morrison continued. "Found records going back to 1847. Different groups, different names, but the same pattern. Isolated compound, missing children, investigations that went nowhere." Sarah's finger traced one of the newspaper headlines: 7 children vanish from mountain commune. The date was October 31st, 1923. "Halloween," she whispered. "Gets worse," Morrison said. "Every 30 years, like clockwork. 1923, 1953, 1983, 2013. Always 7 children, always around Halloween. And always the investigations hit a wall. Evidence disappears, witnesses recant, cases go cold." Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. 2013 was 10 years ago. "Which means we're overdue," Morrison nodded grimly. "But here's the thing that really caught my attention." He flipped to the last page in the folder. "Every cycle, there's a survivor. One child who escapes or is found nearby, usually with no memory of what happened. They're placed with families, adopted, and life goes on. Until what? Until they reach a certain age and start having episodes. Speaking in tongues, predicting things they couldn't know, displaying knowledge that shouldn't exist. Then they disappear again, drawn back to the mountain. The cycle repeats." Sarah's hand found Marcus's arm, gripping tight. "You think Rebecca is one of these survivors? From 2013? "I think Rebecca might be the key to breaking the cycle," Morrison said. "But only if we can figure out what they did to her and why she's different from the others." A commotion erupted from down the hall. Nurses were rushing toward Rebecca's room, their urgent voices carrying over the general hospital noise. Marcus dropped the folder and ran, Sarah and Morrison close behind. They arrived to find Rebecca sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and completely black. Not the pupils, the entire eye, as if someone had replaced them with obsidian spheres. She was speaking again, but this time the language was different. Older. The words seemed to vibrate in the air itself. "She's been asking for you," Dr. Chen said to Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper. "By name, in English. She says it's time for you to understand." Rebecca's head turned toward them with mechanical precision. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from such a small throat. "The shepherd must choose," she said, each word ringing with impossible authority. "Save the lamb, lose the flock. Save the flock, lose your soul. The harvest moon rises tomorrow night, and the compact must be fulfilled. 7 children for 7 years of peace. This is the price that has always been paid." Her black eyes fixed on his, and when she smiled, Marcus saw something ancient and terrible looking back at him. "I am not Rebecca," she said. "I am the door, and you, faithful shepherd, are the key." The basement of the abandoned warehouse reeked of copper and fear. Samuel's hands trembled as he followed the narrow beam of his flashlight down the concrete steps, each footfall echoing like a gunshot in the suffocating darkness. Behind him, Detective Morrison moved with practiced silence, her weapon drawn and ready. The child's voice had led them here, not through words, but through something deeper. Sarah had spoken in that ancient tongue again, her eyes rolling back until only white showed, and Samuel had felt the pull in his chest like a fishhook dragging him forward. The coordinates she'd whispered matched the address Morrison had been tracking through the cult's financial records. "There," Morrison breathed, pointing toward a faint glow emanating from beneath a heavy steel door at the far end of the basement. The sound of chanting drifted through the metal, rhythmic and hypnotic, punctuated by what sounded like crying. Samuel's throat constricted. Children's voices, plural. They approached the door with agonizing care. Through a small window set at eye level, Samuel peered into a scene that would haunt him forever. 13 children, all appearing between 6 and 10 years old, stood in a perfect circle around an ornate altar. Their eyes held the same vacant stare he'd seen in Sarah's face during her episodes. At the center of the circle, a man in flowing black robes held an ancient-looking blade above a smaller child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, bound to the stone surface. The vessel approaches completion, the robed figure intoned in accented English. Tonight, the barriers between worlds grow thin. Tonight, we welcome our master home. Samuel recognized the voice immediately. Dr. Nathaniel Cross, the archaeologist who'd been funding the excavation where Sarah was found. The man who'd claimed to be researching ancient Mesopotamian sites for academic purposes. Morrison was already calling for backup on her radio, her voice barely a whisper, but Samuel knew they didn't have time to wait. The blade in Cross's hand caught the candlelight as he began to lower it toward the child's chest. Without thinking, Samuel burst through the door. "Stop!" His voice cracked like thunder in the chamber. The 13 children turned in perfect unison, their hollow stares fixing on him with predatory focus. Cross paused, his blade inches from the boy's skin. "Mr. Whitmore," Cross said with infuriating calm, "how providential. You've brought our Sarah back to us just in time for the completion of the ritual." "Sarah's not here," Samuel lied, even as he felt her presence behind him. She'd followed despite his explicit instructions to stay in the truck. "Let the boy go, let all of them go." Cross laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You still don't understand, do you? These children aren't prisoners, they're chosen. Just as Sarah was chosen. The entity that has slumbered for millennia in the spaces between our world and the next requires pure vessels to anchor itself in our reality. Children's minds are so beautifully malleable." Morrison appeared in the doorway, her badge held high. "FBI, drop the weapon." The 13 children began to chant in the same ancient language Sarah had been speaking. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the candles flickered as though touched by an invisible wind. Samuel felt something pressing against the edges of his consciousness, alien and hungry and vast beyond comprehension. "You're too late," Cross whispered, and drove the blade downward. Samuel lunged forward, but the children moved to intercept him with inhuman coordination. Small hands grabbed at his clothes, his arms, their grips unnaturally strong. Behind him he heard Morrison's weapon discharge, but the shot went wide as more children swarmed toward her. The blade bit into the altar stone with a sharp crack, having missed its target by inches. The bound boy had somehow rolled away at the last second, his restraints falling loose as though cut by invisible hands. "Sarah!" Samuel gasped, understanding flooding through him. She was here, in this room, fighting back against whatever force controlled the other children. But now Samuel could see her, Sarah, standing beside the altar with her hand on the bound boy's shoulder. Her eyes blazed with an inner light that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with the fierce protection he'd seen that first night when she'd defended herself with nothing but a kitchen knife. "I'm not your vessel," she said in perfect, clear English, "and neither are they." The chanting children stumbled as though a string had been cut. Several began to cry, the normal, frightened crying of traumatized children, suddenly aware of where they were and what had been done to them. In the sudden silence, Sarah's small hand found Samuel's. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing I was worth saving." The basement beneath the abandoned church reeked of copper and decay. Samuel's hands trembled as he descended the rotting wooden steps, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness thick as molasses. Behind him, Detective Morrison's breathing came in sharp bursts, her service weapon drawn but useless against what they might find below. The child, Miriam, as she'd finally told them her name was, pressed close to Samuel's side. Her small fingers clutched his coat with desperate strength, and he could feel her trembling through the fabric. She hadn't spoken since they'd arrived at this godforsaken place, but her eyes held a terrible knowing that made Samuel's stomach churn. "They're here," Miriam whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their footsteps. "The others. They've been waiting." The basement opened into a larger chamber than Samuel had expected, carved from the earth itself. Symbols covered every surface, not the ancient Aramaic he'd grown accustomed to hearing from Miriam's lips, but something older, more primal. The walls seemed to pulse in the flickering beam of his flashlight, and he realized with horror that some of the markings were fresh, painted in what could only be blood. Morrison's sharp intake of breath drew his attention to the far corner of the chamber. A series of metal cages lined the wall, most empty but showing signs of recent use. In the largest cage, 3 children huddled together, their eyes reflecting the light like frightened animals. They couldn't have been older than 10, their faces gaunt with hunger and marked with the same strange symbols that covered the walls. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed, already moving toward the cages. "How long have they been down here?" Before Samuel could answer, footsteps echoed from above. Heavy boots on wooden floors, moving with purpose, more than one person. Samuel's blood turned to ice as he recognized one of the voices drifting down from the sanctuary above. "Bishop Henley." "You should have minded your own business, Brother Reeves," the familiar voice called down. "The Lord's work takes many forms, and not all of them are meant for simple minds to understand." Morrison had reached the cages and was working on the locks with desperate efficiency. The rescued children pressed themselves against the bars, reaching for her with skeletal fingers. Their lips moved in silent prayers, but Samuel caught fragments of the same ancient language that had first spilled from Miriam's mouth weeks ago. "What door?" Samuel asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want the answer. The footsteps on the stairs began their descent. Samuel counted at least 3 sets, maybe 4. In the wavering beam of his flashlight, he could make out more details of the chamber. An altar stood at the center, its surface stained dark and surrounded by candles burned down to stubs. Books lay scattered around it, their pages filled with diagrams and text in multiple languages. Morrison had freed 2 of the children and was working on the 3rd cage when Bishop Henley's voice filled the chamber, no longer muffled by distance. "The ancient texts speak of doors between worlds, Samuel, barriers that grow thin in places of great faith and great suffering. Your farm was one such place. Why do you think the child appeared there? But this place, consecrated in blood and prayer, is so much stronger." Samuel turned to face the stairs as 3 figures emerged from the darkness. Bishop Henley led them, his familiar face twisted into something Samuel no longer recognized. Behind him came Dr. Matthews from the hospital, still wearing his white coat, now stained with red handprints. The 3rd figure was a woman Samuel didn't recognize, her eyes reflecting the light with an unnatural gleam. "You're sick," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "These are children, innocent children." "Innocent," Bishop Henley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "They are vessels, Samuel, conduits to something far greater than your small understanding can grasp. The things they speak, the languages they know, that's not trauma, it's revelation." Morrison had freed the last child and was herding them toward the far corner of the chamber, looking for another exit that Samuel prayed existed. Miriam stepped forward, placing herself between Samuel and the approaching figures. "You failed," she said, her young voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the chamber stop moving. "The door won't open. You broke the pattern when you let doubt into your hearts." Dr. Matthews stepped forward, pulling a syringe from his coat pocket. "1 injection, and she'll be compliant again. The ritual can still be completed. Samuel's hand found the weight of his grandfather's hunting knife in his jacket pocket. He'd carried it for 30 years and never once used it on another human being. But as he watched these monsters advance on a traumatized child, he knew that streak was about to end. The chamber erupted into chaos as Morrison's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkness. "Federal agents, the building is surrounded." The warehouse stood before them like a monument to forgotten sins, its corrugated walls bleeding rust in the pale dawn light. Samuel's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he cut the engine, his faith warring with the terrible certainty that had brought them here. Beside him, Miriam clutched the leather journal they'd retrieved from Dr. Carlyle's hidden safe, the final piece of evidence that had revealed the scope of the conspiracy stretching back decades. "They're expecting us," she whispered, nodding toward the single door standing ajar despite the early hour. Through the gap, candlelight flickered against concrete walls. Samuel's fingers found his temple pendant, the familiar weight offering little comfort now. 3 days had passed since they'd pulled young David from the ritual circle, since they'd watched the archaeologist's careful facade crumble under the weight of his own documentation. The boy waited now in protective custody, his ancient words finally silenced, but the network that had taken him, that had taken so many others, remained. "The sheriff's department won't arrive for another hour," Samuel said, checking his watch. "Carlyle promised he'd testify, but only if we brought him proof that the others were here." The irony wasn't lost on him. For months, he'd questioned whether his decision to help David had been divine inspiration or dangerous delusion. Now, standing on the threshold of confronting evil in its most banal form, his doubts felt like luxuries he could no longer afford. The concrete floor had been painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the candlelight. At the center stood an altar made from stacked stones, its surface stained dark with years of use. Around it, arranged in a perfect circle, sat 7 figures in expensive suits and dresses. The mayor, the bank president, the head of the school board, faces he'd known and trusted for decades. "Brother Samuel," called Mayor Harrison, his voice carrying the same warmth it had during countless town meetings. "We've been waiting for you. Where are the children?" Samuel's voice came out steadier than he felt. The casual admission sent ice through Samuel's veins. "You know about David." "We've always known," Harrison said, rising from his position. "Did you think it was coincidence that brought him to your doorstep?" "You were chosen, Samuel, just as we were chosen. The difference is that we understood our purpose." "To prepare them," corrected Dr. Voss, her clinical tone unchanged from the countless appointments where she'd examined Samuel's own grandchildren. "The old knowledge requires young vessels, pure vessels. Each child we guided served a greater purpose than their small lives could have achieved otherwise." Samuel felt his world tilting. "You're talking about murder." "We're talking about transcendence," Harrison said, "about accessing powers that your simple faith can't even comprehend. David was our most successful subject until you interfered." The mayor began walking toward them, and Samuel noticed for the first time the symbols carved into the man's expensive watch, the pendant hanging from his neck that mirrored the ancient designs covering the floor. "Because God's plan doesn't involve harming children," Samuel said. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the old doubt stirring. Had he been wrong? Had his interference damned an innocent soul? "Doesn't it?" Dr. Voss smiled, and in that expression Samuel saw something that made his blood freeze. "Tell me, Brother Samuel, in all your scriptures, in all your sacred stories, when has God ever hesitated to sacrifice the innocent for the greater good?" The warehouse fell silent except for the guttering of candles. Outside, Samuel could hear the distant sound of sirens, still minutes away. 7 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting for his answer, waiting to see whether his faith would save them all or damn them forever. Samuel looked at Miriam, at the journal in her hands, at the altar that had seen too much suffering. Then he made his choice.